Oh, there's my mic working okay. This is weird. I don't usually do this sort of thing, so it could go either way, okay? But I'm going to talk to you today about visual thinkery. And the problem is that what with my Northern Irish accent and when I start to get passionate about stuff, I tend to speak a bit faster. And anyway, if you start to lose what I'm saying, then hopefully you'll get something from the illustrations, from the pictures, which can all be found. Most of the pictures I do are Creative Commons, or available Creative Commons. So if they're of any use to you, feel free to use them. Yeah, this session is called First I Listen, Then I Draw My Listen, and it's really just a little journey in creativity. I suppose I'm an unlikely or an accidental artist, really. I'm still trying to get used to the term artist, because I'm originally a software engineer, and I've sort of started a few companies and stuff. But I've got into to drawing and in particular listening, and hopefully by the end of this session you'll sort of see maybe how important that listening element is to creativity. I thought I'd give you a little bit of an overview to where I'm coming from. Yeah, I couldn't resist drawing a visual timeline, I have to say. I suppose every time, it's one of those elements of me, it's like a bit of curiosity where I wonder if I could just, what would that look like if I used a cycling metaphor? Or what if, anyway, so I thought I'd try to create a visual timeline anyway, so here we are. But I'm a product of a conveyor belt education system, I think, where I sort of did what my brothers did. I had an older brother I was very influenced by, and I followed the path of least resistance in formal education, right? And that least resistance was quite heavily influenced by the fact that I was good at maths, right? And I was good at maths because, well, my mum was a maths and physics teacher, right? So I had a bit of a head start. And actually, maybe I'm not that good at maths. Maybe it's just the fact that I had a head start when I was compared to anybody else. And so whenever it came to deciding whether I would do music or whether I would do art at GCSE, which is sort of for 14, I suppose, making those decisions, I did maths and science because that's what I was good at. Right? And so I didn't give music or art another thought. And I wonder whether that was the right move, really. Anyway, I ended up going to university to study maths. I realized that actually, if you want to do things like maths and physics at university, you've got to have a beard. I'm not very good at growing beards. So, I ended up as a software engineer because I discovered computing again for the second time, because when I was 10, and things like the ZX Spectrum were around, and I used to be able to get magazines and sort of type in programs, and that really worked for me. But school didn't really understand that. You know what I mean? They didn't really see that as, they just didn't really understand it. I don't know how best to explain it. But in university, I discovered computers again, and also the creativity required to program computers, which is something I think is often misunderstood. How creative programming, in my experience, actually is or can be. I think we push it much more towards sort of maths, maybe, or much more sort of or discipline in terms, as opposed to the fact that when writing any program, there's a bunch of ways to write it. There's no right answer. It's not binary. The irony of that statement, it's not binary. Computing's not binary. You can quote me on that one, right? Anyway. I got a job as a programmer, and I ended up starting my business, or rather, my first business I started with 3 other guys. And I like to think of that period of my life, that little green bit of my life, as my apprenticeship in running a business, or rather, in how not to run a business, right? Because we sort of fell into it. There was 4 of us. We ran it as a democracy. And that meant that if we wanted to make a decision, you sort of had to talk to 3 other guys, and that made it political. And it was an unmitigated disaster. Right? But I didn't know that at the time. I just thought that's how you ran businesses. But looking back on it, actually, it was probably one of the most valuable sort of learning experiences that I had. But I couldn't see that at the time. So I had to go and live in Africa just to escape that business, which is not strictly true. But anyway, I lived in Africa for 2 years for my wife, worked for a Christian organization there, and I also had a job at the University of Dar es Salaam, setting up a web development department, and ended up my son got very ill, and we had to be sort of medevaced out of Dar es Salaam, and I arrived back in London, and sort of fell into my second business, which was a spin out of the first business, but this time I got to be in control, but even then, someone had to nudge me to say, here, do you think you could run this business? Because I've never wanted to run a business. I've just sort of accidentally found myself there. Anyway, but that business did really well, and it grew over a period of 5 years before I sold it to City and Guilds. Right now, goodness me, all my experience up until that point had been, small business, punching above your weight, greater than the sum of your parts. I had a team of about 20 by the time we got acquired by City and Guilds. And City and Guilds is like a 135-year-old awarding body. It's the opposite of the world that I came from, of this sort of small startup. The culture was very political. If you haven't stepped inside an awarding body, and I'm sure there's a lot of knowledge about awarding bodies here, but, writing standards, people deliberating over the verbs in a sentence, in a competency statement, in a unit, you know what I mean? Right in the detail, and the amount of time that takes, and the process that takes, and the culture that then surrounds that, and then how that fits into a big system with sort of, government requirements on the top, and then funding over here, and then sort of, customers beneath that delivering the actual qualifications. The opposite, right? And so I ended up having, wrestling with this, of trying to understand the difference between these two cultures. And after, I suppose, surviving that for a couple of years, I sort of turned into a bit of a consultant for City and Guilds, which I'm thoroughly enjoying because it gives me the freedom to have sort of one foot inside and one foot outside. And it also allowed me to set up a social business, or a non-profit called Wapi Sasa. And I'll tell you about Wapi Sasa in a little bit more detail as we go on, because I set up Wapi Sasa because I was employing programmers who didn't have qualifications. And I valued the fact that they didn't have qualifications, right? And somehow they had taught themselves how to program well enough to be able to blag a job, right? And at some point I came across them, and even though they had confidence issues and a whole load of baggage, they generally didn't fit with school, but were quite creative. And I rated them more highly than the guys like myself who had come through university and ended up with a degree. And I was like, well, how can that be? Maybe there's a bunch of young people who end up sort of falling off the elevator, or off the conveyor belt of education, and who don't quite fit with the system, but who could be good programmers, right? So I thought, well, why don't I try to address that in some sort of way? And Wapi Sasa was my answer to that. And listen, it's the worst name you could give a business. Nobody can actually say it. I have some friends who they've yet to say it right once. You know what I mean? But it actually means, it's Swahili, and it means where now, okay? Because that's the question I was trying to answer in terms of young people who had fallen out of education. And in fact, the first guy that I employed for Wapi Sasa, my first rookie, is the language I use, I employed on his ability to solve a Rubik's Cube, right? So he was a guy who had fallen out of education, and I met him in this very bizarre circumstance after a game of football one day. But he could solve a Rubik's Cube in under a minute. He had built his own computer, yet he was working in a cafe 2 days a week. And I'd recently learned to do the Rubik's Cube, and so had my wife. Sounds really boring, by the way, taking a Rubik's Cube on holidays with your wife. Do you not have much to talk about? Anyway, but we did. We've got kids. You know where I'm coming from. Anyway, but my wife's really wordy, and I'm quite, well, I suppose, not wordy. And I was struck by the fact that whenever we were following instructions of how to solve a Rubik's Cube, and whenever I was trying to explain to her how to get from this bit to this bit, she was like, explain with words. don't just show me. And I couldn't do it because there were like patterns you sort of see patterns when you're solving a Rubik's Cube. And once you see them, it becomes really easy, right? Don't tell anyone I said that, because I impressed loads of people by being able to solve the Rubik's Cube. But it's actually really easy once you see the patterns, right? Anyway, I thought, well, maybe this kid would make a good programmer because he has a pattern-oriented mind, if that means anything. Somebody's going to shoot me down for that one, maybe. But the persistence it takes to get under a minute in a Rubik's Cube is considerable, right? And anyway, I found out more about him, and I ended up employing him, and he has just thrived in the environment that we created. But I'll tell you more about that in a minute. The other thing I did with my foot inside Sitting Gills was the Think Out Loud Club, which is, when you're an awarding body, it's really hard to criticize yourself because you're sort of the police, when it comes to the standards you create. So me and my boss at Sitting Gills thought, well, how could you take an alter ego of yourself, where a sort of a slightly different brand that allowed you to ask questions about assessment, or about assessment methods, or about technology and education, or whatever. And therefore, the Think Out Loud Club is the other area that I've created a lot of these visual thinking. Oh, I meant to point out one thing. I only started drawing in 2013, right? So my journey of my journey of actually creating this sort of stuff that I'll show you is very recent, I suppose. But before I continue with that story, let me just jump to tell you this story, right? Because this is something that my 10-year-old son created, The Adventures of Pantsman, right? And we've got a culture of drawing in our house. It doesn't really come from me. We don't have a TV, and my kids, they like to draw, right? And our next door neighbour came along one day with a load of sort of 200 sheets of really thick card. And it was at the same time that my son had sort of invested in a whole bunch of Sharpies. Do you know what Sharpies are? They're like permanent markers, really, really crisp permanent markers. So the environment was set for my son, who had this little germ of an idea to create a comic, right? And listen, as parents, you're just like, oh, let me just try to encourage that sort of idea, right? That sort of creative idea. Anyway, his idea was The Adventures of Pantsman. And he sat down one day and then created a whole page of comic. And the other thing we have in our house is that if I really like something that my sons have created, I'll tweet it. I'll tweet it out, right? And then the day afterwards, my son will come to me and say, how many people saw the thing that I created? And well, let's just have a look. Oh, look, 112. And the thing I noticed about my son's creations are they get a much higher engagement rate than mine, which is disgraceful, really. But after creating one, this is a little excerpt from a comic entitled "The Spider That Farts a Lot," right? And this is the spider roaming the world, right? So one comic turns into two comics, as in two pieces of A4. And so I say to them, well, hey, if you finish this off, I'll scan it in and I'll print out a few copies, and we could sell it. And he's just like, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So before I know it, there's a puzzle page, right? This is part of the puzzle page, and also a competitions page. And before too long, there's a 14-page comic book called The Monthly Meep, right? Now, considering it's called The Monthly Meep, and I don't think there's going to be issue number 2, I don't know. He just launched himself into it, right? A friend of mine, Doug Belshaw, suggested that, well, why don't you sell this online as well? So Ruben thought that was a good idea, so we did. And okay, Granny bought 2 copies and actually hasn't figured out how to open either of those 2 copies. But I didn't really expect. There were some parents with kids our age who also thought, hey, that's going to be perfect for my kid. I'll buy that. And to date, we've sold about 25 copies, right? 25 copies at 50p or 50 pence a throw. And my son, who's 10, has made over £10, right? And he's loving that. He's put in a lot of effort, but he's loving that. But what what really struck me was what were the ingredients of that creative process, okay? And this is in no means scientific, by the way, but this was just me reflecting and also looking at my own creative journey that I've gone on and tried to understand what were the bits that made this happen, because I'd love to recreate it. I'd love my son to be, in fact, all three of my sons to be creating all sorts of stuff. But there was definitely a purpose. So at some point, the idea of a comic, and I am going to create a comic, but some sort of vision or purpose in his head. The curiosity, I suppose, to be able to, I wonder what it would look like if I wonder if that spider was, you know what I mean, and to develop that. The encouragement, I have really benefited from encouragement. In fact, it's one of my biggest tools, I suppose, that there was a guy who I ended up drawing up his thought on Twitter, and his statement was, encouragement is verbal sunshine. And I love that visual metaphor, because I think it's really true. And whenever I started to draw, thinking that someone would tap me in the back going, yeah, that's not very good, Brian. Whenever people actually said, oh, I really like that, or that really resonated with me, or at least found something about it that was good, it made me want to draw more. It's simple stuff. You all know about this stuff, and especially if you're coming from a teaching background, you know how important encouragement is, and feedback, I suppose you could wrap into there. But persistence being really key to that as well, in terms of persisting with an idea, and especially depending on what frame of mind you're in, is really key. And also this one here, confidence, which ultimately you have to have enough confidence to even start. But confidence plays a big part in the whole journey. And this was a thing I really learned whenever I took on young people with no credentials and tried to gauge them to be programmers, was how important confidence played a part in that. Okay? So my own learning journey, started from a point of frustration. I was trying to explain to these guys in IT in City and Guilds the principles of what I thought were learning technology development, that we should follow. And I wasn't having much success by shouting at them. So I thought by maybe drawing some things on the iPad with a stylus that I'd been mucking around with, that would be a good start. And it seemed to resonate with people. So I thought I would do some more. At City and Guilds in the Wisdom put me on this sort of government panel. It was like a sector panel looking at technology and further education. It was called FELTAG. And I sort of looked around and thought, well, look, everybody's contributing words here. If I contributed pictures, that would be something different, and that would be something complementary. And they ended up in the final report, which I took to be massively encouraging, because they fitted alongside and actually made the report something special, I thought. And therefore, the Think Out Loud Club came out as a result of that. And so, I'll just take you through some of the stuff that we've created as a result of the Think Out Loud Club. This was a thought I caught at the ALT conference. We've got some friends from the Association of Learning Technology today, and they invited me along to their conference. And this was Catherine Cronin. If you know Catherine Cronin, was speaking about this idea of education changing from a centralized instruction to a broad network of creativity. And I just tried to capture that while she was still speaking, and then tweet it into the sort of the back channel while she was still speaking, and people really resonated with that. So I thought, okay, well, I'm onto something here. And another one from that conference was she was talking about the learning black market, and this bridge of dissonance between formal learning and informal learning. I thought, the bridge of dissonance, right? That's a bridge. What is it a bridge between? Informal learning, what does that look like? And I'm constantly asking that question, what does that look like? Or what? And often people will use all sorts of visual metaphors that are just asking you to be turned into images. Steve Wheeler, this was a lovely little snippet in one of his blog posts about the difference between formative assessment and summative assessment, where formative is when the chef tastes the soup and summative is when the guests taste the soup. And I just thought that was so articulate, that I had to turn it into an image. And it's not really much of an image, but Edutopia picked it up, and it's fairly popular one, I suppose. Ken Robinson, I started sort of dialing into what sort of little recorded videos of what people were saying. So, and Ken Robinson was, again, he's very rich in his metaphor. He's very, very good orator. But he was talking about teaching is not a delivery system, it's an art form. And I don't know, I just grabbed onto that and had to turn it into an image which he kindly retweeted, which was good. But even just my own thoughts of, and again, having one foot inside sort of a standards body and one foot very much outside and looking at sort of linear, and look, I'm sure you could pick a lot of holes with this illustration, but it's my experience that learning isn't linear, and that there's multiple directions to go on, and it's maybe linear if you look backwards in terms of the path that you've come, but looking forwards, it's just options. So trying to capture that in a sort of in a visual way, again, seemed to resonate with people. We even started, this is a thought from a guy who ran the IT department in a further education college in London. And again, this was one of his students had said this, and I just thought, oh my goodness, that's so articulate. Why can't we be tested on what we learn rather than learn what we're going to be tested on? Which sort of sums up my problem with assessment, right? Or even things like this, where standards and standardized often get mixed up, and standards I think are an incredibly worthwhile thing to be aiming towards. And even this image taught me that whenever you create an image, there's ambiguity around the image. Different people will see different stuff in an image, and I think that's a good thing. And it depends how you're shaping the image. If you're trying to tell people what to think, then I try to steer away from those sort of images. But if you're trying to open something out or explain something or draw contrast, then then I think that those are the sort of images that really help people wrestle with something or understand something or even potentially change their position on something. That's a hard thing to do. Or even trying to take something and unpack it. So this is the diffusion of innovation, which whenever I came across this, it just, it hit me on the side of the head like a ton of bricks, because in one of my businesses, I had done a lot of traveling trying to explain e-portfolios to various different institutions. And one institution would be so warm and open, and another institution would be so closed. And on paper, they look very similar. But what I didn't understand was this in terms of the difference between an early adopter, I suppose, and a laggard. I also find that adding a little bit of humor, tends to disarm people so that they can consume your images as well. And, if you're maybe from the UK and you know what Waitrose is a sort of a posh supermarket. At least I think that's, I think people would agree with me if I was to say that. But I kept finding myself in meetings where, the people around the table were all people who had done well as a result of the system. And you were trying to think about the system and how it could be better. And actually, the big blind spot was, well, what about all the people who hadn't done well as a result of the system, or that the system hadn't suited? And anyway, and even, I found myself listening into conversations. And, I met Audrey Waters recently, and again, this was just an off-the-cuff comment that she made that I just thought was lovely, and created a laptop sticker for her that, again, she kindly shared. Jumping onto the Wappy Sasa journey. Again, I found it very healthy to be to have a foot in two very different camps, right? But with some of the same issues, in there. So I've already spoken about education and its linearness. But this, I can't believe that, as I'm 40 years old now, but I can't believe that it took me to be, 38 until I'm thinking about this sort of thing, that I thought the purpose of education was about getting a job, was about credentials and job and whatever, rather than it being about creating the best possible version of you. I can't believe I didn't see that, and this came as a result of attending a conference where cleverer people than me were talking about this stuff and saying about let's not get confused about the breadth of education and what it needs to provide. And this has been my experience in Wappy Sasa, certainly, in terms of especially that finding. I think those potential assets aren't immediately obvious in the development of young people, right? And to give you an example, one of the young people I employed, I asked him to do some wireframes, and we had a sort of oh rats, I'm so behind time, goodness me. Right, I'm not going to tell you that story. You can ask me afterwards if you want that story. Wabi Sasa, a non-profit digital agency. We're trying to be a business, but we're non-profit and we only take on young people who are credential poor, okay? But we're looking for young people who have got a bit of creativity, who we can fit in a team, and who are going to develop real stuff from day one. They might need a lot of help to do that, but the purpose is going to be there, okay? And we're going to try to help them on that journey. I really didn't understand what this was whenever we created it, but I understand now how much baggage a young person has who has dropped out of the education system and how much help they need, especially in regards to self-confidence. But if you can help them unpack that, oh my goodness, the potential is so great. And we're going to try to use open badges to do it, to try to reward small steps of achievement. And we were going to give them a day a week to be able to work on their own stuff, which again was a sort of a throwaway thing at the start, but became one of the most important parts of the rookie journey. Let me see, the funny thing about Wabi Sasa was, I didn't get funding for it. I couldn't get funding for it because it wasn't a silver bullet. It's narrow and deep, right? It's the long game in helping a young person unpack that stuff, okay? And even though it's been really successful, we've only helped 2 young people. And I've got number 3 lined up to start off in January. And I'm really pleased about that because we've changed some lives, right? And we've really helped people. But it's not something that you can really scale out. But I was really struck by the fact that if more people copied that sort of approach, then it would still have a bigger impact. But it's unfundable because any funder wants to have the biggest hit with the money that they've got to fund things with. Okay, so they're looking for things that will scale rather than things that can't scale. Another thing, I'm going to skip through the open badges stuff because I found that also you can use visual thinkery to get behind a movement, and I've tried to do that with open badges. And to try to illustrate why I think open badges offer so much potential, and that they in terms of recognizing small steps of achievement, but also recognizing potentially different things like, I don't know, like honesty or integrity or sense of humor. I'm struck by how important sense of humor is in the workplace, and yet it's very hard to see how funny someone is through an interview process. But also just trying to paint a picture about what a world might look like with a constellation of pathways. This was a thought by Carla Casilli. Or even to try to understand, might there be different groups of badges, and might they have different properties? And might that help us understand how to craft a badge in a better way? Or even how to put badges together in terms of pathways, and how that might suit some things. I'll just say there that myself and Doug Belcher have created something called Open Badges 101, which is essentially all the artwork that I've created and all the wordsmithery that he has written, and to try to put that together. So that's available at badges.thinkoutloudclub.com if that's of interest to you. Now, one last thing I want to leave you with, right, because I know that I'm out of time imminently, right? But I was at a school last week, and I was trying to impart on them 2 things, which I'm going to try to impart on you lot, okay? And the first is this, that there is only one you. You have a unique perspective on the world. Okay? You're a product of your experiences. Okay? And if you were to create something and you were to allow yourself to be part of that creation, that thing would be unique. Right? It would be different from what anyone else could create. Okay? And the second thing I was trying to impart on them was, when it comes to drawing, it's just practice. Right? You talk to adults, you're like, oh, I can't draw. Oh, no. But actually, it's just practice. Okay? You probably don't believe, but it's true. That has been my experience. And so I went to this school and I gave them a little challenge to, number 1, draw a little self-portrait, then to look at the self-portrait and to write a statement of what you think that self-portrait is actually saying. Okay? And I went around just taking photographs and sticking them on Twitter if they were appropriate, right? But some of them came up with some brilliant things. I particularly like this one up here, which is mooses are being shot. Maybe that was one for Stephen Downes there, in terms of the moose problem in Canada, which there probably isn't one. But there were these two girls who were, when we grew up, we're going to go to Canada and we're going to save mooses. I'm like, that's amazing. Anyway, but just unearthing what, I suppose, what some of these young people were thinking. But I'm going to give the same challenge to you guys. And see it as a OEB 15 visual thinkery challenge, right? So if you want to take note, it's not compulsory, but if you'd like to draw a little self-portrait and have a look at it and see, draw a statement beside it of what you think that self-portrait's actually saying, and tweet it out. And I'd love it if you could tweet it to me, and if I like it, I'll retweet it, right? So anyway, I'm going to stop there because I know that probably eating into Donald's time. But thank you very much for listening to me. Cheers.